The morning they came for the house, Loretta Mae Vanden was standing at the kitchen sink, washing a single coffee mug. She had been washing that mug every morning for 41 years, ever since the day she and Harold moved into the house on Sycamore Bend with nothing but a second-hand sofa and a card table they used for dinner until he built her a proper one from salvaged pine. She remembered that, the sawdust in his hair, the way he measured twice and cut once, the way he said a thing worth doing was worth doing right. She was thinking about all of that, about Harold and the pine table and the smell of sawdust, when she heard the car doors. She did not rush to the window. She was 71 years old, and she had learned long ago that rushing toward trouble never changed what trouble was. She dried her hands on the dish towel with the faded blue stripe and walked slowly to the front room, where the light came in gray and thin through the curtains, and she looked out. 2 cars. Her son Derek's silver sedan, and beside it a newer vehicle she did not recognize, charcoal gray with tinted windows. Derek was already out and moving toward the porch with the purposeful stride she had come to dread over the past year. The stride that meant he had decided something and was bringing her the decision as though it were a gift. Her daughter Paulette was in the passenger seat of Derek's car. She did not get out right away. That told Loretta something too. She opened the door before Derek could knock. He looked startled, which pleased her in a small, private way. "Mom," he said. "Good. You're up." "I'm always up," she said. "You know that." He stepped past her without being invited in, which he had started doing about 8 months ago, somewhere around the time he and Paulette had begun talking about what they called her situation. He brought the cold in with him. The man in the charcoal vehicle did not get out. Paulette was coming up the porch steps now, her coat buttoned to her chin, her eyes doing the thing they did when she was guilty about something, sliding sideways, finding interesting things to look at that were not her mother's face. Derek was already in the front room with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the walls, at the furniture, at the house the way a man looks at a car he is thinking of trading in. Loretta stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the front room and waited. She had become very good at waiting. Harold had told her once that patience was just courage wearing a quieter coat, and she had carried that with her like a stone in her pocket, smooth and reliable. "We need to talk," Derek said. "I assumed," said Loretta. Paulette sat on the arm of the sofa, perching, not committing. It was something she had done since childhood, when she was not sure which way things would go. Derek pulled out his phone and turned it toward her. A document, dense with type. She did not reach for it. "We spoke to an attorney," he said. "About the estate. About the house." "This house," she said. "Yes. This house that your father and I paid for together. That I have lived in for 41 years. Mom." His voice went to that register, the one that meant he thought she was being difficult. "The attorney says that given Dad's passing and the way the estate was structured, there are some questions about the deed." She looked at him steadily. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that need to be resolved," he said. "And the thing is, the market right now is strong. Really strong. Terry says he can get us 800 for it easy. Maybe more." "Terry," she said. She looked at the charcoal vehicle through the window. "That would be Terry. He's the best in the county." Paulette said it quickly, helpfully, the way she always rushed in to smooth things when Derek's edges became too visible. Loretta turned and looked at her daughter for a moment. The little girl who used to fall asleep on her shoulder during long car rides. The little girl who brought her dandelions because she did not yet know they were weeds, or maybe knew and did not care. "And where," said Loretta, "am I supposed to go?" Derek had prepared for this. She could see it in the way his body shifted, the slight squaring of his shoulders. "We found a place. It's really nice, actually. It's called Meadow Glen. Assisted living. Private room, your own bathroom. Activities. They have a garden program." "I have a garden," Loretta said. "Mom, I have a garden and I have this house, and I have lived here since before either of you was born, and I am not leaving it to go to a place called Meadow Glen, so a man named Terry can sell the walls I painted and the floors your father laid." The room was quiet for a moment. Wind moved through the old oak in the front yard, and its shadow shifted across the floor. Derek said, his voice lower now, more careful, "The attorney believes it could go to probate if you don't cooperate. That means a judge decides. And a judge might decide that a woman living alone in a house this size is not the best use of the asset." "Asset," she said. He had the grace to look uncomfortable. "It will take a few weeks to get the paperwork in order," he said. "We're not trying to rush you. We just need you to start thinking about it." She let the silence hold. She was very good at that, too. She let it hold until Paulette stopped looking at the curtain rod and looked at her instead. And in her daughter's face, Loretta saw what she always saw underneath the compliance and the sideways glances. She saw a girl who had been told what to want for so long she had forgotten how to want anything else. "I will think about it," Loretta said finally. And that was the truth. She would think about it. She would think about it every morning over the coffee she drank alone at the pine table Harold built her. And she would think about it at night when the house settled around her like an old friend making itself comfortable. And she would think about it when she looked out the back window at the long slope of yard that ended where the property line met the edge of the old orchard, and beyond the orchard, just visible through the bare trees, the peaked roof of her father's workshop. The workshop that had been sealed since 1961. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Her father's name had been August Vanden. He had come to this part of the county in 1938 with a toolbox and a single suitcase and a particular way of seeing the world that did not require other people's approval to function. He built things. That was what he did. He built the farmhouse that Loretta had grown up in, 3 miles east of the house on Sycamore Bend. And he built furniture that people drove from 3 counties over to buy. And he built his workshop at the edge of the orchard with the same care. He gave everything: stone foundation, hand-hewn beams, a roof that shed water the way it was supposed to even in the worst years. He sealed it in November of 1961, and he told no one why. Loretta had been 13 years old. She remembered the day clearly, the thin cold of it. Her father in his heavy canvas work coat walking to the workshop with a length of chain and a padlock she had never seen before. He locked the door. He stood outside it for a moment with his hand on the wood. Then he walked back to the house, sat down at the dinner table, and asked her mother to pass the salt. He never went back. He never spoke of it. And when he died in 1987, he left the workshop to Loretta in a separate paragraph of his will, in language so deliberate and specific that it seemed like a message rather than a bequest. The workshop, all its contents, and the land it stood upon he left to his daughter Loretta, not to her husband, not to her children, to Loretta alone. His handwriting in the margin of the will, which the attorney had said was not technically part of the document, but which no one had challenged, read, "She will know when the time is right." She had not known. Not for 34 years. She had walked past the workshop, kept the chain oiled so the lock would not rust through, cleared the brush that wanted to reclaim the stone foundation, and waited for the knowledge her father seemed to think would come to her. Now, in the thin gray light of the morning, her children had come to take her house, standing at the kitchen sink with her dried hands and her quiet heart. Loretta thought, maybe this is the time he meant. The next 3 weeks moved the way difficult things do, in short, sharp moments separated by long stretches of waiting. The attorney Derek had hired sent paperwork. Loretta's own attorney, a woman named Greta Holst who had handled Harold's estate and who did not particularly like being hurried by anyone, read through it and called Loretta on a Tuesday evening with news that was not good, but was also not as bad as it could have been. The deed, it turned out, had a complication. Harold had refinanced the house in 2003 without Loretta's full understanding of what she was signing, and the resulting structure left enough ambiguity that Derek's attorney could make a credible argument, not a certain one, but credible enough to make a court battle long and expensive. Greta said, "You could fight it." She said, "It would take time and money." She said, "I want you to know all your options." Loretta asked how much the legal fight would cost. Greta told her. Loretta was quiet for a moment. Then she asked a different question. She asked about the workshop property. She asked whether the separate bequest in her father's will was clean and uncomplicated. Greta said, "As far as I can tell, completely. Your father owned that land outright. He left it to you outright. Your children have no claim on it, and neither does Derek's attorney." "Good," said Loretta. She made her decision that night. Not in anger, not in defeat. In something older and quieter than either of those. She made it the way her father used to make things, measuring twice, cutting once. She told Derek she would accept the settlement. She would take the money they offered for her share of the house, which after attorney's fees and the mortgage complication was not $800,000, but was not nothing either. She would not go to Meadow Glen. She would not go anywhere that had a garden program in place of a real garden. She was going to live in her father's workshop, or in whatever she could build around it, on the land her father had given her. Derek stared at her across the pine table. Paulette's hand went to her mouth. Mother, Derek said, that building is 60 years old. It hasn't been opened since before I was born. I know when it was sealed, said Loretta. It could be structurally unsound. It could be full of rot. You can't just own it, she said. Free and clear. Your attorney said so. That doesn't mean you should live there. You're 71 years old. She looked at him with the patience that was just courage wearing a quieter coat. I know how old I am, Derek. Paulette said, quietly. Mom, what if there's nothing there? What if it's just an empty old building? Then it's an empty old building that belongs to me, said Loretta, and I'll figure out what to do with it. She watched them process this. She watched Derek try to find the legal angle and come up short. She watched Paulette try to find the caring argument and discover it required believing in her mother's capability, which was harder for her than it should have been. They left without resolving anything. She supposed they would talk about it in the car on the way home, the two of them and Terry from the charcoal vehicle, all of them deciding what her life should look like from the outside. She went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. Then she went to the drawer where she kept important papers, and she found the small envelope her father's attorney had given her in 1987 along with the copy of the will. She had opened it once, when it was first handed to her, and she had looked at what was inside, and she had not fully understood it, and she had put it away to wait until she did. She opened it now. Inside was a key. Old, heavy, iron, the kind that required a specific lock and would not fit anything else. Attached to it by a piece of string was a small card in her father's handwriting. On one side, he had written the date, November 14th, 1961. On the other side, he had written 4 words. For what it holds. She put the key in the pocket of her cardigan. She stood at the kitchen window and looked out across the yard and the bare orchard to where the workshop roof showed dark against the sky. The lock she had been keeping oiled for 34 years. The lock her father had put on that door the same month he stopped working, the same month he stopped saying what he was thinking, the same month something changed in him that she had never been old enough or close enough to understand. She was old enough now. She stood there for a long time, the key warm in her fingers, while the kettle began to sing. The morning she left the house on Sycamore Bend for the last time, Loretta did not make a ceremony of it. She was not a woman who confused ritual with meaning. She packed what she needed. Her clothes, her photographs, Harold's copy of the Psalms with his handwriting in the margins, her cast-iron skillet, her good kitchen knife, a box of tools from Harold's garage, and her dog, a 12-year-old beagle named Clarence who was mostly deaf but still capable of profound loyalty and an excellent opinion of himself. She put Clarence on the passenger seat of her old Jeep, and she drove out of Sycamore Bend without looking in the rearview mirror. Not because it hurt too much, because she was looking forward. The workshop property was 3 acres of mixed terrain, mostly the old orchard her father had planted and then abandoned to its own wild devices. The trees had kept going without him. They were gnarled and overgrown, heavy with unpruned years, but she could see the bones of the original planting still, the rows her father had put in with a surveyor's care. Apples, mostly. A few pears. One enormous quince in the southeast corner that was older than the planting itself, older than the workshop, possibly older than anything else on the property except the stone. The workshop sat at the north end of the orchard, backed against the property line where a low stone wall marked the edge of the old Halvorsen farm, which had been subdivided and sold in pieces years ago, and was now a neighborhood of modest houses that turned their backs to the wall. She pulled up along the fence line and stopped, and she and Clarence sat for a moment looking at it. It was bigger than she remembered. Or maybe she had been smaller when she last paid it full attention, small enough that the scale of things her father built still had the power to dwarf her. The stonework of the foundation was solid. She could see that from here. The boards of the walls had gone silver with age, but showed no obvious collapse. The roof had a sag in the southeast corner, but not a catastrophic one. The single window on the north face was filmed with decades of grime, but unbroken. The door, which faced south toward the orchard, was wrapped in a chain that was indeed still good. Loretta had oiled it regularly, even on years when she told herself she was doing it out of habit and not out of hope. The padlock hung at chest height, heavy and dark, and she stood before it now with the iron key in her hand. She did not feel dramatic about it. She was not that kind of woman. She put the key in the lock. It went in the way things go when they were made for each other, without resistance, without ceremony. She turned it. The mechanism moved stiffly, but it moved. The shackle released. She caught the padlock before it could fall, and she unwound the chain carefully and set both on the ground beside the door. Then she put her hand on the door. The wood was cold and rough beneath her palm. She could feel the grain of it, the decades of it, the hands that had made it and the hands that had closed it, and the long silence of all the years between. Her father's hand had been here last. His palm against this same grain on a cold November day in 1961, when Loretta was 13 years old and the world was a different place, and something had caused August Vanden to lock his workshop and walk away from it and never go back. She pushed the door open. The smell came first. Dust and wood and something deeper, something mineral and dry. The smell of a space that has been kept but not touched, preserved without being alive. Light came in past her, thin and wintered, and fell across a floor she had to blink to believe. She stood in the doorway for a long moment. Clarence pressed against her leg, his old nose working. The workshop was full. Not cluttered. Full. The way a library is full, with intention, with organization, with care. Her father's workbenches ran along two walls, still holding their tools in the order he had kept them. Chisels in graduated size, planes lined up, levels and squares and awls in the wooden holders he had made for each. Sawdust still lay on the bench surfaces, undisturbed, as though he had only stepped outside for a moment. But that was not what stopped her. What stopped her was in the center of the room. There were paintings, stacked carefully against every available surface, wrapped in cloth that had gone yellow but held. Not a few. Dozens. More. The stacks went 3 and 4 deep, wrapped and tagged with small paper labels in her father's handwriting. Labels so faded she would have to get closer to read them. And on the east wall, which she had not been able to see from the door, hung the only unwrapped piece, a canvas perhaps 3 feet by 2, a landscape she did not recognize, but which had been painted by someone who knew exactly what light did to things. Loretta stood in the doorway of her father's sealed workshop, and she tried to remember whether she had known he painted. She had not known. She was absolutely certain she had not known. She stepped inside. She did not touch the paintings that first day. She told herself it was because she needed to assess the space practically, to understand what she was working with before she let herself feel anything about it. That was the sensible approach. That was the approach her father would have taken. But the truth, which she admitted only to Clarence and only in the privacy of her own thoughts, was that she was not ready. Whatever her father had sealed in this room had waited 63 years. It could wait another day while she found her footing. What she did instead was work. She was good at that. She had always been good at that. She opened the north-facing window, which required effort and a flathead screwdriver and some language she would not have used in company, and let air move through the space for the first time in decades. She swept the floor carefully, working around the stacked canvases, using the old broom she found hanging on a nail by the door as though her father had expected someone to need it. She assessed the roof from the inside, standing on the workbench to reach the low corner where the sag was, pressing her palm to the boards and finding them soft, but not yet failed. A repair, not a replacement. She could manage that. She found, in the deep cabinet beneath the south workbench, 3 hurricane lanterns still holding oil, a box of matches that had gone damp but still lit on the 3rd or 4th strike, a stack of old wool blankets in a cedar chest that the moths had not found, and a camp cot folded flat and leaning against the back wall as though placed there with intention. She stood with the camp cot in her hands for a moment and looked at it. It was not the kind of thing you kept in a workshop by accident. It was the kind of thing you kept in a workshop if you intended for someone to sleep there someday. She set it up in the northwest corner, away from the roof sag and away from the paintings, and she made it up with 2 of the wool blankets. And she went out to the Jeep and brought in her box of provisions, her cast-iron skillet, her good knife, Clarence's food and water bowl, and her own pillow in its worn case. She found an old wood stove in the corner she had not noticed at first, small and efficient, the same model her grandfather had kept in his barn, and she got a fire going in it with which she found already split and stacked against the outside south wall, dry enough after all this time, because her father had thought to cover it with a length of oilcloth weighted at the edges with stones. August Vanden had thought of everything. That was the thing she kept coming back to. He had left nothing to chance and nothing to accident, and if you were standing in his workshop paying attention, you understood that its contents had not been abandoned. They had been prepared. She ate a simple dinner sitting on an upturned crate near the wood stove, Clarence at her feet with his gray muzzle resting on her boot, and she watched the lantern light move across the wrapped canvases and tried to make sense of the shape of what she was looking at. The stacks varied in size. Some of the wrapped pieces were small, the size of a book, the size of a window pane. Others were large, as tall as she was and wider, leaning against the walls at careful angles with cloth padding between them so no edge touched another without protection. The paper labels on each were small and square and written in her father's compressed, deliberate hand, but she was too far away in the lantern light to read them, and she had decided she was not touching anything until the morning. She slept better than she had any right to. The wood stove held its heat through the night with the slow, patient reliability of well-made iron, and the blankets were good wool, and Clarence curved himself against her knees with a contentment that suggested he considered the arrangement a significant improvement over their recent circumstances. When she woke, the light was coming in gray through the north window, and a bird was working at something in the orchard, and the iron key was in her hand, which was strange because she did not remember picking it up in the night, but supposed she must have. She made coffee on the wood stove in the old tin percolator she had packed, because she was not a person who could think clearly before coffee, and she sat on the camp cot with the mug warming her hands and looked at the unwrapped painting on the east wall. It was a landscape, rolling land under a particular quality of light, the kind of light that exists in the last half hour before sunset, when the horizontal rays catch everything from the side and make it glow from within. A tree line in the middle distance. A structure, small and partially obscured, that might have been a barn or might have been a house. And in the foreground, water, a pond, or a slow river bend, catching the light and throwing it back in pieces. It was not a famous style. It was not the kind of painting she recognized from museums or textbooks. But it was not amateur work either. There was something in the handling of the light, the way the painter had understood what light actually does rather than what people think it does, that spoke of real knowledge, real practice, real years of looking. Her father had been a carpenter, a craftsman, a man of wood and stone and iron. She had never seen him with a brush in his hand. She had never seen a canvas in the farmhouse, never seen him at an easel, never heard him speak of painting in any context whatsoever. She looked at the painting for a long time. Then she set down her coffee and walked to the nearest stack of wrapped canvases and read the label on the topmost piece. It said, Orchard, Late Summer, 1953. And below that, in smaller letters, A.V. August Vanden. Her father. She stood with her hand resting on the wrapped canvas. And she felt something move through her that was not quite grief and not quite wonder, but occupied the territory between them. She had known her father for 49 years. She had thought she knew him well. He was not a complicated man, or so she had believed. He was a man of few words and great precision, a man who expressed himself through what he made rather than what he said, a man whose love was legible in the care he took with things. She had thought she understood all of that, but he had painted, for years, or perhaps all his life. In this workshop at the edge of the orchard, he had made something she never knew about. And then he had sealed the door and walked away and left her a key and a note that said for what it holds. And the knowledge of what it held had waited in the dark of this room for 63 years, patient as iron, patient as stone. She did not unwrap the canvas. Not yet. She walked instead to the east wall and stood before the unwrapped landscape and looked at it again with different eyes. The structure in the middle distance, the small shape partially obscured by the tree line. She looked at it until she understood what she was seeing. It was not a barn. It was a workshop. It was this workshop, painted from a vantage point that would be somewhere in the middle of the orchard, sometime in the last half hour of a summer evening. Painted by a man standing in his own orchard looking back at the place where he made things. Painted, she realized, by a man who already knew he was going to seal the door. She sat down on the floor of the workshop with her back against the workbench and her knees to her chest, and she let herself feel it. All of it. The house on Sycamore Bend and the pine table and Harold's handwriting in the margins of the Psalms and her children's careful voices delivering their decisions. Her father's hand on this door. The weight of all the years she had walked past this building telling herself she was waiting for the right time and never quite believing the right time would come. Clarence came and put his head in her lap. She put her hand on his warm side and felt him breathe. After a while she got up and made more coffee and began, carefully, to count. There were 47 wrapped pieces. She counted them twice to be sure. 47 canvases wrapped in cloth and labeled in her father's hand, plus the one unwrapped piece on the wall, which made 48. The labels she could read varied in their information. Some gave only a title and a date. Some gave a title, a date, and a location. A few gave only a date and the initials AV. The dates she could read ranged from 1946 to 1961, which meant he had been painting for at least 15 years before he sealed the door. 15 years of work that no one in his family had known about. She thought about that. She thought about what it meant for a man to keep something that large and that sustained completely to himself, not out of shame. She did not think it was shame, but out of some private necessity she was only beginning to understand. Her father had been a man who expressed himself through what he made. She had always thought she understood that, but she had only understood the half of it that he let her see. Outside, the orchard was brightening into a pale winter morning. She could hear a tractor somewhere in the distance, one of the neighborhood properties. The world was going on as it did. She had a roof that needed repair and a building that needed weatherproofing and a life that needed reconstructing, and she was 71 years old with money from the settlement that would not last forever and a collection of paintings she did not yet know how to think about. She wrapped herself in one of the wool blankets and took her coffee to the doorway and stood looking out at the orchard. The apple trees stood in their old rows, winter bare, each one shaped by its own private argument with gravity and time. She could see the stone wall at the property edge, and beyond it the backs of the modest houses, most of them with their curtains still drawn at this hour. She could see the enormous quince in the southeast corner, its branches extravagant and reaching. She thought, I am going to need help. Not the kind of help Derek thought she needed. Not someone to make her decisions, or manage her circumstances, or move her somewhere manageable. She needed the kind of help that is really just knowledge she did not possess, and that was a different thing entirely. She needed to know what she had. She needed to know what her father's work was worth, not in the emotional sense. She already knew what it was worth in that sense, but in the practical sense that would determine what she could do next. She had spent 41 years of marriage watching Harold know how to ask for help with the things he did not know. He was not too proud for that. It was one of the things she had loved most about him. He knew what he knew and he knew what he did not know, and he treated both kinds of knowledge with equal respect. She went back inside and sat at the workbench and began to make a list in the small notebook she kept in her coat pocket. At the top she wrote, "What do I need to know?" Then she wrote, "Who painted these?" She crossed that out because she knew who painted them. She wrote instead, "Were they ever shown?" Then, "Are they significant?" Then, "Who would know?" She looked at that last one for a while. She had not been a person who moved in art circles. Harold had liked music. She liked gardens and practical things. But she was the daughter of August Vanden, and she had grown up watching a man who cared deeply about craft, and she had absorbed without knowing it a respect for the seriousness of made things. She understood that what was in this room had been made with seriousness. She just did not yet know how to find the people who would understand that. She thought of the library. It was the same thought that had served people well before the age of knowing everything immediately. The thought that someone had organized knowledge somewhere, and you could go find it if you were willing to make the effort. She would start there. But not yet. She was not ready yet to bring the outside world into this. She needed a few more days alone with it first. She needed to learn what was here before she invited anyone else to have an opinion about it. So for the rest of that day and the 2 days that followed, Loretta worked. She repaired what she could repair alone. She borrowed a ladder from the hook on the outside of the workshop wall where her father had hung it and where it had stayed, aluminum and still sound. And she got up on the roof and assessed the damage and made a temporary patch with the roll of tar paper she found under the workbench, weighed down with stones against the wind. She insulated the gaps around the window with strips of cloth cut from a blanket she deemed sacrificial. She found a second lamp and got it working and arranged the space so that she had a corner that was living space and a corner that was kitchen and a corner that was sleeping. In the center, an east wall where the paintings lived remained undisturbed. She unwrapped one painting each evening. She did it slowly, sitting on the floor with the wrapped canvas in her lap, peeling back the cloth with the care you would use for something fragile, which she supposed it was. She set each one against the east wall beside the landscape that hung there, and she looked at it in the lantern light, and she let herself simply see it without trying to evaluate it. They were landscapes, all of them. Different seasons, different times of day, different weather. All of them in the same general territory. She recognized the hills and the particular flatness of the valley floor, this county, these fields, these stands of oak and hickory. Her father had painted the world he lived in. He had painted it over and over again, year after year, looking at the same land in its different moods and finding it endlessly worth seeing. They were not all equally accomplished. The earlier ones, from the late 1940s, were surer in some ways and less confident in others, as though he was still working out the argument between what he saw and what the paint could do. By the mid-1950s, something had settled. The brushwork became quieter and more certain. The light became the subject in a way it had not been before. And by 1959, 1960, the last 2 years she could identify by date, there was something in the work that she could only describe as mastery, though she was not sure she was qualified to use that word. One painting in particular stopped her. She found it in the third stack she unwrapped, labeled only November 1961 and nothing else. No title, no location, no initials, just the date. She set it against the wall and looked at it for a long time. It was the orchard in late autumn. The trees stripped bare, the sky a particular shade of gray that was not quite white and not quite blue but held something of both. In the foreground, the stone wall. And in the middle distance, the door of the workshop, closed, the chain just visible, and a figure standing before it. A man, his back to the painter, his hand on the door. Her father had painted himself sealing this room. He had stood outside and painted the moment from memory or from imagination, himself standing at the door with his hand on the wood, and then he had wrapped the painting with the others and sealed them all inside. She sat with it for a very long time. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. It was on the 6th day that the knock came. She was at the workbench when she heard it, sorting through a wooden box she had found in the deep cabinet, a box of papers and receipts and small envelopes that she had not yet examined carefully. She had been going through them slowly, reading her father's handwriting in the receipts, learning the economics of his craft from the numbers he had recorded, finding in the margins of old orders the occasional note that was not about wood or stone or iron, but was sometimes a phrase, sometimes a word, sometimes just a mark she could not decipher. The knock was not her children. She knew that from the sound of it. Her children knock the way people knock when they think they have the right to be let in. This was different, uncertain, polite. She went to the door and opened it. A woman stood in the orchard path. She was perhaps 60, lean and weathered in the way of people who spend significant time outdoors, with short gray hair and the kind of eyes that assess things carefully before committing to a response. She carried a casserole dish covered in foil. "I'm sorry to bother you," the woman said. "I'm Ruth Halvorsen. I live in the blue house over the back wall." She nodded toward the neighborhood that backed up to the stone wall along the property line. "I saw smoke from the chimney, and I wasn't sure if someone was actually living here or if there was a problem, so I made a pot of something and decided to come find out." Loretta looked at the casserole dish and then at Ruth Halvorsen. "Halvorsen," she said, "your family owned the farm." "My grandfather did," Ruth said. "He sold it off in pieces in the 60s. That's when this neighborhood went in." She paused. "You're August Vanden's daughter. I recognize you, though it's been a long time. You knew my father." Ruth was quiet for a moment in a way that meant she was deciding how much to say. "I knew of him," she said. "My grandfather talked about him. There was a history between the families." She looked past Loretta into the workshop and something shifted in her face, though she did not say what it was. "You opened it," she said. "I opened it," said Loretta. They looked at each other for a moment. Then Loretta stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "I have coffee." Ruth Halvorsen sat on the upturned crate with her casserole dish on her knees and looked at the painting on the east wall for a long time before she spoke. The lantern light was good by now. Loretta had become skilled at arranging it, and the landscape with the workshop in the middle distance held its quality even under imperfect conditions. "He could paint," Ruth said finally. "You sound unsurprised," said Loretta. "My grandfather knew he painted. He said August was the most gifted man in the county and also the most private about it. He tried once to get him to show his work in town. There was a gallery in those days on Main Street. Your father refused. He said the work wasn't ready. Loretta looked at the painting on the wall. 15 years, she said. He spent 15 years on it and said it wasn't ready. Ruth looked down at her hands. There's more to it than that, she said. If you want to hear it. I want to hear it, said Loretta. Ruth set the casserole dish carefully on the workbench. She said, my grandfather and your father were close friends for a long time. This was before the war. During. After. They worked together on various things. Your father built furniture, and my grandfather provided some of the timber from the farm. That kind of friendship, built on work and proximity and a shared way of thinking about things. She paused. In 1958, she continued, a man came through this county. A buyer, a dealer. He was traveling the rural areas looking for what he called undiscovered American work. He'd heard of your father through someone. I don't know who. And he came out here, and my grandfather brought him to meet August. He saw the paintings. Loretta was very still. He wanted everything, Ruth said. He offered a significant amount of money, which was real money in 1958. Your father considered it. He thought about it for a long time, my grandfather said. And then he said no. Why? Said Loretta. Ruth looked at her steadily. Because the man said he would need to take them to New York. Because he said the paintings would be sold to private collectors, and August would likely never know where they ended up, or who had them, or whether they were cared for. And your father could not accept that. He had spent years on this work. He could not give it to strangers who would put it in rooms he would never see. Loretta looked at the painting on the east wall, the light on the water, the workshop in the distance. The man who had made this standing in his orchard in the light, he understood better than anyone. Then what happened? She said. The dealer came back in 1961, Ruth said. He came back with better terms. A gallery show. Attribution. Public record. He had done well in the years between, and he was a more serious man. My grandfather thought your father might agree this time. But something had changed. He wouldn't say what. He just said no again. And that November he sealed the workshop. And then, said Loretta, and then my grandfather died in 1963, and whatever else there was to know about it went with him, Ruth said. She looked at the stacked canvases along the walls, at the careful cloth wrapping, the small paper labels. Except that your father kept them. He could have burned them. He could have sold the building and let someone else deal with it. He kept them, and he kept them well, and he left them to you. Loretta was quiet. The wood stove ticked. Clarence made a small sound in his sleep from the camp cot. Do you know, she asked, how many pieces he made? I've counted 48. Ruth shook her head. My grandfather never said. But he said August painted every evening after the workshop day was done. He said it was as necessary to him as eating. Years of evenings, she said. Could be more than 48. Loretta thought of the box of papers she had been sorting through on the workbench. She thought of the envelopes she had not yet opened. Stay for dinner, she said to Ruth Halvorsen. Ruth looked at her for a moment, and something in her face opened the way a window opens when someone finally remembers it's been closed too long. I brought enough for two, Ruth said. I was hoping you'd ask. They ate the casserole, which was chicken and root vegetables, and something aromatic that Loretta thought might be thyme. Sitting across from each other on the upturned crates with the lanterns between them and the paintings around them, and the old wood stove keeping the room at a temperature that required only one layer but invited two. They talked for a long time. Not only about the paintings, about the county, which had changed in the ways all places change, losing some things and finding others. About Ruth's work, which was land conservation, which she did through a small nonprofit she had founded 20 years ago, and which still kept her busy enough to feel useful. About Harold, whom Loretta spoke of simply and directly, without the careful editing she had been doing lately for other people's comfort. About what it meant to be a woman of a certain age in a world that was always surprised when you could still surprise it. Ruth did not ask about Derek and Paulette. Loretta appreciated that. The story was visible enough in the circumstances without requiring narration. Before she left, Ruth stood in the doorway and looked back at the painting on the east wall one more time. She said, I know an art historian. She's at the university, about 2 hours from here. She specializes in American regionalist work, the kind of painting that was being made outside the cities in the mid-20th century that nobody talks about because it doesn't fit the story everyone agreed on. Ruth paused. She looked at Loretta. She would drive out here for this. Loretta looked at the painting too. At the light. At the careful, honest rendering of a world she recognized. Give me a week, she said. I need another week alone with it first. Ruth nodded, as though she understood exactly why, which Loretta believed she did. Take the time you need, Ruth said. It's waited this long. She walked out into the dark orchard, and Loretta stood in the doorway of her father's workshop and watched the lantern of Ruth's phone light bobbing away through the trees. And then she went back inside and shut the door and sat down on the floor before the east wall painting and looked at it in the quiet way she was learning to look at things. Her father had painted the world he lived in because it was worth painting. He had kept the work to himself because he could not give it to people who would not care for it. He had left it to her because he believed she would know what it held. She was beginning to understand what it held. And she was beginning to understand something else too. Something that had started as a small thought on the first morning and had been growing steadily in the days since. A thought she had not yet let herself say out loud. She thought, "My children sold my house without understanding what a house is." She thought, "They looked at everything I had and decided what it was worth, and they were wrong about all of it." She thought, "My father was dismissed by one dealer and then another, and he refused to let their judgment become the truth about his work." She put her hand in the pocket of her cardigan and found the iron key and held it in her fist, the way she had taken to doing in quiet moments, and she thought, August Vanden knew something about being underestimated, and he left the answer to it in a room that could only be opened by the person he trusted to understand it. She looked around at the 48 paintings in the lantern light. She was his daughter. She understood. The weeks she had asked for passed the way good weeks do, too quickly and with too much in them. She finished unwrapping every canvas. She arranged them in order by date along the walls of the workshop, moving the workbenches to create space, working slowly and with great care so that no edge met another without cloth between them. When she was done and she stood in the center of the room and turned, slowly, looking at all of it, she felt something she had not felt in a long time. She felt the presence of a person she had loved who was gone, not the absence of him, but the presence, as though August Vanden had stepped back into the room through the work he had left behind and was standing quietly at her shoulder, saying nothing, waiting to see what she would do. She read the papers from the box. It took 2 full evenings, sitting at the workbench with the lantern close, going through the envelopes and the folded receipts and the small ledger pages one by one. Most of it was what she had expected, the economics of a craftsman's life, the orders taken and completed, the materials purchased, the careful accounting of a man who did not waste and did not spend beyond what the work required. But in the back of the box, beneath everything else, wrapped in the same oilcloth her father used to protect his woodpile from rain, she found a bundle of letters. 12 letters, all from the same address in New York City, all addressed to August Vanden at the farm, all signed with the same name, a name she did not recognize, Solomon Greer. She read them in order. The first was dated March 1958, and it was the letter of a man who had seen something that surprised him. The language was restrained and professional, but underneath it she could hear the excitement, the way a person sounds when they are trying not to sound too eager because they understand that eagerness shifts the terms. Solomon Greer wrote that he had seen August's work through the recommendation of a colleague, and that he believed it to be of exceptional quality, and that he would be honored to discuss the possibility of representation. He wrote that he understood the rural American landscape tradition, but that August's work was doing something he had not quite seen before, something with light that he could not easily describe, but that he believed the right audience would respond to immediately and completely. The second letter, from May of the same year, was a follow-up. Warmer. He had received August's refusal and he was not surprised. He wrote, because he had heard that August was a private man, but he wanted August to know that his concern for the work's future was a concern he shared. He was not in the business of scattering things, he wrote. He was in the business of finding work its proper home. There were 3 more letters from 1958, each one a patient and respectful continuation of the conversation, each one addressing a specific concern August had apparently raised in correspondence that was not in this box. By the 5th letter, she could reconstruct the shape of her father's objections from the shape of the responses. He was worried about dispersal. He was worried about attribution. He was worried about the work being sold to people who would put it in storage and forget it. He was worried, she thought, about the same thing he was always worried about, which was things made carefully being treated carelessly. There was a gap then. No letters from 1959 or 1960. And then, in January 1961, Solomon Greer wrote again. This letter was different. The professional language was still there, but something underneath it had changed. He wrote that he had given considerable thought to August's concerns and that he had a proposal. He had in the previous year established a relationship with a regional museum, not in New York, but in the upper Midwest, a serious institution with a serious collection that was actively building its American regionalist holdings. He believed he could negotiate a single collection placement, meaning all of August's work would go together to one institution, where it would be cataloged, attributed, exhibited, and preserved permanently. No dispersal, no private collectors. A public institution where anyone who wanted to see the work could see it. He wrote, "I believe this is the arrangement you have been waiting for. I believe this is how the work finds its proper future." Her father had written back. She knew this because Solomon Greer's next letter, from March 1961, responded to something August had apparently said. And what August had apparently said was, "I need more time." The last letter in the bundle was dated September 1961. 2 months before the door was sealed. Solomon Greer wrote that he understood August needed time, but that the museum's interest could not remain open indefinitely, and that he was asking, as a friend now and not only as a professional, for August to make a decision. He wrote, "Whatever is holding you back, I want you to know that the work deserves to be seen. Whatever happened, whatever you are protecting, the paintings themselves are not responsible for it, and they should not be the ones who pay the price of silence. Whatever happened, whatever you are protecting." Loretta set the letter down and looked at the November 1961 painting, the one with no title, the one with her father's back to her and his hand on the door. She looked at it for a long time. There was something she did not know. There was something her father had been carrying that had made him say no at the last moment when he had been so close to saying yes. And that thing was not in any of the letters she had found, and it was not in the ledger pages or the receipts, and it was not in the 4 words on the card attached to the key. For what it holds, she had understood that to mean the paintings. But now she was not certain it meant only the paintings. She slept restlessly that night, and in the morning she called Ruth Halvorson. Ruth's art historian colleague was a woman named Dr. Celia Martin, and she arrived on a Saturday morning 11 days after Loretta had first opened the workshop door. She came in an old Volvo with 2 thermoses of coffee and a canvas bag full of reference books and a portable ultraviolet lamp, and she stood in the doorway of the workshop for a full 30 seconds before she stepped inside, the way a person stands at the edge of something they need to prepare themselves for. She was perhaps 55, with paint under her fingernails that Loretta suspected was not accidental and reading glasses pushed up on her head that she kept forgetting were there and reaching for on her face. She moved through the room carefully, not touching, just looking, her eyes going from canvas to canvas in the deliberate way of someone who has spent a professional life learning how to see. She said very little for the first hour. Loretta did not press her. She made coffee from one of Ruth's thermoses, and she sat on the camp cot with Clarence, and she watched Celia Martin look at her father's work. Finally, Celia crouched before the November 1961 painting, the one without a title, and she was quiet for a long time, and then she said, without turning around, "How much do you know about the American regionalist movement?" "Enough to know my father was working in it," Loretta said. "Not enough to know where he stood in it." Celia turned and looked at her. "Your father was not working in the regionalist movement," she said. "He was working alongside it. There's a distinction. The regionalists, Grant Wood, Thomas Hart Benton, that generation, they were making a statement. They were arguing for something, for the validity of rural American life against the dominance of the European avant-garde. Your father was doing something different. He wasn't arguing. He was just looking." She stood up and turned to the large canvas that Loretta had placed at the center of the east wall, a painting from 1959 of the valley in winter fog, the kind of fog that erases distance and makes the world intimate and uncertain. It was the one Loretta privately thought was the finest piece in the room, though she had no credentials to support that opinion. "This," said Celia Martin, "is not the work of a self-taught amateur who happened to be talented. This is the work of someone who understood exactly what he was doing and chose to do it privately." "Did he have any formal training that you know of?" "None that I know of," said Loretta. Celia looked at the painting for another long moment. "Then how?" she said, not to Loretta but to herself, or to the painting, or to the general question of things that did not fit their expected categories. "How?" Loretta told her about the letters. She brought the bundle from the box and set them on the workbench, and Celia read them with the same focused attention she gave the paintings, reading once quickly, and then going back to certain passages and reading them again. When she finished, she set them down and removed her reading glasses from her bag, where she had finally thought to put them, and cleaned them on her shirt, and said, "Solomon Greer." "You know the name," said Loretta. "I know the name," said Celia. Solomon Greer was a dealer in New York from the 1950s through the 1980s. He was not famous, but he was respected. He had an eye for what he called work that the market wasn't ready for yet. She paused. He died in 1994. His gallery closed when he retired, and most of his records went to a university archive in Boston. She looked at the letters again. "I didn't know he had ever been in this county." "He was here twice," Loretta said, "and he wrote 12 letters." Celia was quiet for a moment. She said, "He mentions in the last letter that something happened. Something your father was protecting. Do you know what he meant?" Loretta said, "Not yet." That yet sat in the room between them like something that had been placed there deliberately. Celia spent the rest of the morning with the ultraviolet lamp, moving it slowly across the surface of each canvas, checking for restoration, for overpainting, for signatures hidden or altered. She found no restoration and no overpainting. She found, on 7 of the canvases, small initials in A corner that were not visible under normal light, not AV, but a different mark, 2 letters she could not immediately identify, painted in the same pigment as the canvas ground, so that they vanished into the surface unless the light hit them at exactly the angle the ultraviolet created. She photographed each one without comment. She would need to look at them more carefully, she said. She would need to consult certain records. She left at mid-afternoon with photographs of every canvas and a promise to return within 2 weeks. At the door, she turned and looked back at the room one more time, at the paintings in their ordered rows along the walls, at the old wood stove and the camp cot and the workbench and the lanterns, and she said, "Your father understood something about patience that most people don't. He believed the right time would come." She looked at Loretta. It did. After she left, Loretta sat for a long time in the quiet. Clarence slept. The orchard outside was bare and still. She thought about the hidden initials and the last letter and the words "whatever you are protecting," and she thought about her father standing at the door with his hand on the wood, and she thought about the key in her pocket and the 4 words on the card. For what it holds. She had been thinking about it as a description. But what if it was an instruction? For what it holds, meaning, use this for the purpose of what is inside. Use what is inside for its proper purpose. Open it when you can do what I could not do. What had he not been able to do? He had not been able to let the work go. He had not been able to trust that it would be cared for in his absence. But she was not him. She had spent 41 years in a house that Harold built her, watching the things she cared for outlast the fears she had about losing them. She had a different relationship to letting go. She had practice. 2 weeks later, almost to the day, Celia Martin called. She did not call with small talk. She said, "I've been in the Boston archive. I found Solomon Greer's records from this county." She paused, and in the pause Loretta heard the shape of something significant. "The hidden initials," she said, "the ones on the 7 canvases. They're not your father's initials. They belong to a painter named Edith Voss." Loretta was very still. "Voss," she said. Celia said, "Your grandfather's name was Voss. On your mother's side." It was not a question. She had looked it up. "Yes," said Loretta slowly. "My mother was a Voss before she married my father. Her family was from the northern part of the state." Celia said, "Edith Voss was a painter who showed briefly in Chicago in the late 1930s and then disappeared from the record entirely. There's very little documentation. A few reviews, 1 photograph, a single canvas in a small collection in Illinois that was attributed to her for years and then quietly de-attributed when the collection changed hands." She paused. Solomon Greer's records include a note from his 1958 visit to this county. He wrote that August Vanden showed him work he described as his own, but that Greer had a private suspicion, which he noted and then set aside, that some of the pieces had been made by more than one hand. Loretta sat down. The camp cot received her weight with its familiar give. "My mother," she said. And then she stopped because she was doing the arithmetic of dates, and understanding was arriving not all at once, but in pieces, the way light arrives through fog. Edith Voss had been her mother's given name before she married. Her mother, Eleanor Vanden, née Voss, who had been a quiet woman, a practical woman, a woman Loretta had thought of all her life as the steady background against which her father's more vivid character played out. Her mother, who had died in 1979 and who had never in Loretta's memory picked up a brush. Except that she had. Before the marriage. Before the children. Before the practical life that practical circumstances required of women of her generation and her place. She had painted in Chicago. She had shown her work. And then she had come back to the county and married August Vanden, and the painting had stopped, or had seemed to stop, but had not stopped, because August had been keeping it alive in this workshop at the edge of the orchard, and the initials hidden in the ground of 7 canvases were not his initials, but hers. Celia said, carefully, I think your father was painting in collaboration with your mother, or completing work she had begun, or both. I think that's what he was protecting, not just his own work. Hers. Loretta looked at the east wall, at the landscape with the workshop in the distance, at the light on the water that she had thought was her father's understanding of light, and now understood was not entirely his alone. That's why he couldn't let it go, she said. Because if he did, Celia said, he would have to explain. He would have to tell the story of Edith Voss, who had been a painter before she was a wife, whose work had been folded into his because there was no other way to preserve it in the world they lived in. He would have to make her visible, which she had chosen not to be, or which circumstances had chosen for her, and he did not have her permission to make that choice for her, because she was still alive in 1961, and it was not his decision to make. Her mother had died in 1979, 18 years after the door was sealed. He waited for her, Loretta said. He sealed it until she was gone, and then he couldn't open it himself, because by then he was too old and too tired and too long without the habit of it, and so he left it for me. She heard Celia on the other end of the line, not saying anything in the careful way of someone who is present with you in a hard moment. Loretta said, how significant is this? In terms of what it means for the work. Celia said, I want to be honest with you because you deserve that. I don't know yet. Finding a body of collaborative work from this period, work that includes a woman, painter whose practice was essentially erased by circumstance, that is historically significant regardless of the market value. Whether the market agrees with the history is a separate question and one I can't answer until we have proper authentication and documentation. But I want you to know what I think, which is that this is not a small thing. This is not a charming local discovery. This may be something that changes how we understand a particular strand of mid-20th century American painting, and the woman at the center of it is your mother. Loretta looked at the painting on the east wall. She looked at the light on the water. She thought about her mother at the kitchen table, her hands always busy with something practical, her eyes always moving to the window, always looking out at something Loretta had never thought to ask about. What was out the window of the farmhouse kitchen? The orchard. And at the edge of the orchard, this workshop, sealed and quiet, holding everything she had once been. She said to Celia, what do we do next? Celia said, I want to bring in a colleague who specializes in authentication. And I want to contact the University Archive in Boston about Greer's full records. And I think we need to talk about what you want the outcome to be, because that will determine the path. There's the question of a museum. There's the question of scholarship. There's the question of public exhibition. And there's the question of what happens financially. Those are not the same question, and they don't all have the same answer. I know what I want, said Loretta. I want my mother's name on the work that is hers. I want people to be able to see it. And I want it to stay together. There was a warmth in Celia's voice when she spoke again. Then that's what we'll work toward, she said. After she hung up, Loretta sat for a very long time in the workshop that her grandfather had built and her father had filled and her mother had partly made. And she held the iron key in her hand, and outside the orchard was moving into the first suggestion of a pale winter dusk, the light going horizontal and gold the way it does in the last half hour before dark. The way her mother had understood it. The way her father had learned to see it from her. The way it lived now in 48 canvases along the walls of this room, waiting to be seen. Derek called that evening. He did not call often, but when he did the calls had a shape, a purpose. He was checking on the situation, which was his way of saying he was checking on whether she had yet understood that the situation was not sustainable and would she please reconsider Meadow Glen. He said, Mom, it's getting cold. Are you actually living out there? I am, she said. In that building. In my father's workshop, yes. He was quiet in the way that meant he was deciding between several versions of the same concern. He said, Paulette drove out last week. She said the roof looks bad. The roof is patched, Loretta said. It will hold the winter. And then what? He said. In the spring, then what? You can't live in a workshop forever. You're 71 years old. She thought about what Celia had said. She thought about 48 paintings and 2 painters and a story that had been sealed in this room for 63 years. She thought about Solomon Greer writing the words, "Whatever you are protecting," not knowing that what August was protecting was his wife's hidden life. "I have some things in motion," she said. "When there's something to tell you, I'll tell you." Derek said, "What things?" "What does that mean?" "It means I'm not going to Meadow Glen," she said. "And it means I know what I'm doing. And it means I'd like you to trust me for once without requiring me to prove it to you first." The silence that followed was the silence of a man who had been his mother's son for 47 years and had consistently underestimated her and was, somewhere underneath the certainty, beginning to suspect that this was a pattern with consequences. He said, more quietly, "Are you okay?" She looked at the paintings in the last of the daylight, at the landscape her father and her mother had made together out of an evening's light on a valley that had been their whole world. She thought about what it meant to look at something carefully for years and understand it more deeply each time. "I'm better than okay," she said. "I think I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." She said good night, and she put the phone in her pocket and she lit the lanterns one by one, moving along the walls, and the light came up slowly across the paintings the way evening light comes up across a landscape you know well. And she stood in the center of the room that had been sealed and was now open, and she felt, for the first time in a long time, the specific and irreplaceable feeling of a life that is going in the right direction. Clarence raised his gray head from the camp cot and looked at her with his old eyes, the eyes of a dog who has seen most things and considered most of them acceptable. She went to the wood stove and put more wood on the fire. Then she pulled the camp stool to the east wall and sat before the painting her father and mother had made together, the light on the water, the workshop in the distance, the world they had looked at every day of their lives and found worth painting. And she stayed there until the night was full and the fire was low and outside the orchard was dark and still and full of the particular silence of things that have waited a long time for the right moment and have finally, at last, arrived at it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.